Would you ever buy an off-brand chainsaw? Well, what are the reasons to even get one? The main one being cost. That way you can get a big, powerful saw for a pretty cheap price. Now that's great and all, but what are the drawbacks for choosing low cost? Unfortunately, I can think of at least one good reason: parts. Fortunately, not all the parts are going to be an issue, as you're going to see with this one. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very blue chainsaw, and the problem is that it won't start. Of course, I'm never going to tell you to go out and buy a commercial chainsaw, but I would at least consider getting one that you can easily find parts for. Now, I am going to try and repair this chainsaw, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in this video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. So this chainsaw belongs to a good friend of mine, and when they told me they had a saw that wouldn't start, I thought they were going to bring over a name brand saw. So you can guess how very surprised I was when I saw this one. Now this is the very first model I've seen from this brand, but according to the information I've found, it's supposed to be from a company in the US, although you could probably guess it was made somewhere else. Now remember, my only recommendation was that you get one that was at least a name brand with parts support. This one is a prime example of what not to get, because even though this company is located here in the US, the parts are quite difficult to find. Of course, you can probably find the common parts, but what if the part you need is not common? Then what? Now with most chainsaws I work on, I'll typically give them a quick cleaning, that way I don't get my filming equipment covered in dirt, oil, or sawdust. But if your chainsaw is not dirty, then this step is obviously not needed. I can't tell how much this chainsaw was used, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was used enough. There is one thing that doesn't make any sense, which is this saw was only ran with canned fuel. So why would it have any issues? Isn't canned fuel supposed to keep this problem from even happening? Now I can't answer that question just yet, but when we get further into this repair, I might have a couple of ideas as to why. So the first step is to empty out the fuel from the tank and see if there's anything wrong with it. Now first off, there wasn't a lot in there, however there was enough for it to start and run. Now the fuel color is really interesting, but depending upon the brand of canned fuel, this color should be normal for it. Now as far as I can tell, this fuel is perfect, which still doesn't tell us why the engine wouldn't start. Now while I'm here, I need to see if the fuel filter is still attached to the fuel line in the tank. The reason why is because if it's come off the line, the carb could be clogged with debris, and that could explain why it wouldn't start. But as you can see, the filter is still connected to the line, which means we'll have to keep looking for a different reason. Of course, the next step is to get down to the carb, remove it, and see if there might be something wrong with it. So this being the first time I've seen this brand, I had to look around for the best way to get to the carb, but it wasn't too difficult to figure out. I'm pretty sure that this model closely resembles a different brand, so if you have an idea as to which other brand I'm thinking about, please let me know. Now I don't think I need to take the spark plug out of the engine, but I wouldn't mind taking a look at it. Now because of the lack of excess carbon on here, it's pretty obvious that this engine hasn't been ran all that much. That and the fact that it is a brand name spark plug, I'm very certain that the plug is not the reason why it won't start. And as you can see, the cover I just took off was there to help hold the guide for the choke lever along with the on-off switch. That means the carb is only being held to the engine by two long bolts that's also holding the air filter base to it. You can also see that this gasket that's supposed to seal against the air filter looks more like an old rubber band than an O-ring. This was done with some cost savings in mind, so I might recommend replacing it with a large O-ring later on. After removing the rubber piece for the throttle adjustment, disconnect the black hose for the impulse line and the yellow hose for the fuel. We can then work the carb off the throttle linkage. Now the first part I want to take off the carb is the pumping side, that way we can see if the pumping diaphragm is having any issues. However, I was happy to see this brown diaphragm because this material rarely has any problems, unlike the other types of materials it could be made out of. Next, I want to check for any amount of debris on the round inlet screen. Large amounts of debris would keep the carb from being able to deliver any fuel to the engine. Now there is some debris on the screen, but it's not bad enough to cause our issue. That means we'll have to move on to the metering diaphragm next, which is under this metal plate. Now, its job is to help control fuel flow through the carb, and if it's not working like it should, it would certainly cause the engine not to start. Now, the diaphragm is supposed to be soft and pliable, which surprisingly it still is. However, there is a problem with it. I don't know if you can tell this, but the stem in the middle is crooked. That means the diaphragm is misshapen, which can have a huge impact on how the carb works. Now the reason why the stem is crooked is because the diaphragm has a couple of wrinkles on the outer edge of it. Of course, I shouldn't have to say this, but the best route to take would be to replace it, and that should get us one step closer to getting this engine working again. Next, we need to test whether or not fuel will pass through the inlet screen after pressing on the rocker arm. And as you can see, the fuel I put into the pocket over the screen disappeared through it, which is exactly what we want it to do. Now, if for some reason yours doesn't do this, then you'll need to clean the screen with carb cleaner until it does. Now, you can just buy the metering diaphragm if you wanted to without having to buy the whole rebuild kit. But if you do it that way, it's going to be at least $5 for just the one, but take my advice and buy a kit of at least 3 of them for only a couple of dollars more. That way, if you end up needing another one in the future, you'll have one ready, and it'll be much cheaper than buying another single one. Now, after replacing the diaphragm with a new one, we can now start to put the carb back together. So you might have noticed that I did not put the carb into the ultrasonic cleaner or even bother to use carb cleaner on it. Well, that was done by choice. I don't think the carb needed to be cleaned because everything looked great and the only real problem I saw was a bad diaphragm. However, this would have been a great time to do a good cleaning on it, but I'm just choosing to be lazy and hopefully this won't come back to haunt me. Now, after getting the carb back together, I'll then work it back onto its linkage and then check to make sure that it still works. Then I'll start to put the hoses back on, reconnect the choke linkage, followed by the air filter base. Now once the carb is back onto the engine, I'll then pour some fuel into the tank and show you something kind of interesting. Now this engine does not have a purge bulb, and what that means is that the engine is not going to start on the first, second, or even the third pull. Now the reason why is because the first couple of pulls are supposed to help pull fuel from the tank and get it to the carb. So in order to have a more predictable start, I'm going to show you what I do. Now, in this case, the spark plug is gone, but it doesn't have to be. Next, I'm going to pull on the rope a couple of times and you'll see fuel start to move up the fuel line towards the carb. So this is exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and if yours is not doing this, then you might have a problem with your carb. So what would have happened if I didn't see fuel moving up that fuel line? Well, unfortunately for me, I would have started to look for a new carb, but if you want to go through the carb again, well, that's up to you. I also noticed that the inside of this air filter had some debris in it, which is not supposed to be there. But once I got a better look at it and realized that the air filter wasn't even sealed, it was clear to me that this air filter wasn't designed very well. Now, I'm not going to make any claims, but a subpar air filter is a really good way to make sure that the engine will not last past its EPA rating. Now, what do I mean by its EPA rating? Well, every small engine is supposed to have an air index rating from 1 to 10. And below that number, there should be an emissions compliance period given in hours, but having an air filter that wasn't filtering as well as it should be would definitely have an impact in the numbers of those hours. It almost sounds like it was done on purpose, but like I said earlier, I'm not going to make any claims here. Now once the carb is back together, I'll then replace the spark plug, air filter, and then the top cover. After that, I need to do something about the tension on that chain. Now, I would follow whatever your owner's manual says about the tension for your chain, but as for this one, it's a bit loose for me. Now after loosening the bar nuts, I'll then raise the nose of the bar and then start turning the adjuster until I'm comfortable with the tension. After that, I'll then tighten the bar nuts and then make sure the chain still moves on the bar. Now before I start it, I do want to make sure there's some bar oil in the tank, and fortunately for us, there's plenty in there. After that, we'll try and start it and see how it runs. So as you just saw, it started fine. However, it didn't want to rev up when squeezing the trigger. Now when it does this, it typically means the engine is not getting enough fuel from the carb and will need to adjust it to deliver more fuel. Now for this part, I'll need a special tool to be able to turn the L screw, which is used to adjust fuel when the engine is at low speed. Now I do apologize for the terrible angle, but I'm going to turn the L screw a quarter turn and counterclockwise to start off with. Well, it turns out this chain is still very sharp, and that pretty much confirms how little the saw was used. So we only had to make a small adjustment to the carb to get it to run, and I'm very happy with how this repair turned out. Now, to be honest, it's a pretty good saw, but if you want to know how difficult it is to get parts for it, just look up the model and serial number and you're going to see how difficult it can be. So what do I think happened to this chainsaw then? Well, my only guess is that even though they were using canned fuel, which has the ability to be kept in the machine for a long period of time, I still think the damage to the diaphragm was because it was put up in its storage case without any sort of preparation. The least you could do was leave the saw running and pinch off the fuel line with your fingers or some pliers. That would starve the carb of any fuel, and that way the diaphragm will have less of a chance to get damaged. So my question is, do you do any sort of preparation when storing your saws after use? Even I'm guilty of some really bad habits, so don't think I'm perfect either. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.